She collapsed in the snow, her black dress soaked through, her breath too faint to rise, banished, pregnant, and alone. Just as her eyes began to close, a shadow on horseback emerged through the blizzard, silent and towering. He lifted her without a word. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The wind did not howl. It pressed, heavy and suffocating, dragging the sound out of the world until even the creaking of trees was smothered beneath the weight of white. Snow blanketed everything, not in softness, but in silence, as though God himself had turned away and left the earth to smother its outcasts. Sarah Whitlock was no longer walking. She was surviving each step. Her boots, once polished for church, were soaked through, black leather cracked and blistered with cold. Each footfall was guesswork now, a blind negotiation with the earth beneath the snow. She didn't look back. The village was behind her, an architecture of righteousness and rot. New hope, they called it, but there had never been hope there for her. She had arrived with George, full of quiet dreams and a hand that trembled only when she tried to laugh. He had loved her, simply and without grandeur, and she had loved him with everything she hadn't yet lost. When the tree fell, it cracked more than bone. It cracked the fragile story they'd tried to build, that good people, if quiet and obedient, would be spared. She had mourned him openly. Worn black, refused to remarry, kept to herself. And still, the judgment came like snowdrift, soft at first, then choking. Her belly had betrayed her in the end. The proof of her husband's love grew inside her, and with it, the town's disdain. They hadn't said whore out loud. They had said shameless. They hadn't called her child a curse. They'd said troubling circumstances. The preacher's wife, a stone of a woman who smiled only when others cried, had led the final prayer as Sarah was cast out. "This is not exile," she said. "This is correction." Sarah hadn't spoken. She knew better than to reason with people who used God as a weapon. Now the ache in her legs blurred with the fire in her lungs. Every breath tasted like ice. Her fingers clutched the letter in her pocket, not for the promise it held, but for the memory of how it felt to be seen. Benjamin Cole's words had been plain, perhaps even indifferent, but they hadn't asked her to explain herself. That was enough. When she finally collapsed, it wasn't with drama or dread. It was with resignation. The crooked pine stood like a witness, gnarled and ancient, its bark stripped by wind. She fell beside it, not in fear, but in peace. If this was how it ended, at least it was honest. And then, hooves. A figure through the blur, snow shifting under boots, a voice low and steady. "Easy now, I've got you." She wasn't alone, not anymore. The room smelled faintly of pine smoke and saddle leather, and Sarah lay cocooned in blankets that carried neither perfume nor dust, only the quiet scent of a place lived in by someone who didn't speak often. Her eyes fluttered open to the kind of firelight that flickered without urgency. Somewhere nearby, the wind scratched softly at the eaves like a memory trying to come in. Every inch of her ached, not from injury, but from thawing. Her fingers tingled as circulation returned. Her lips cracked when she tried to part them. She wasn't dead. That was her first clear thought. The second was that she hadn't been left. Her gaze moved slowly across the room. Sparse, functional. The kind of place shaped by calloused hands and long days. No lace, no curtains, no evidence of a woman's touch. Yet somehow, it didn't feel empty. The kettle near the stove steamed gently. A chipped enamel mug sat beside the bed, filled with broth still warm. A woolen coat was draped across a chair, its collar darkened by years of use. And there, across the space, Benjamin Cole sat sharpening a knife by the hearth. He didn't look up. The rhythm of the whetstone continued, slow and deliberate, as though he were giving her time to become real again. She shifted slightly and the blankets rustled. Only then did he speak. "You're safe." His voice had weight, but not harshness, like something anchored in the earth. She watched him for a moment, his face marked by years and sun, beard unkempt but not neglected. He wasn't old, just weathered in the way men became when no one spoke to them unless something broke. "Why?" she asked, her voice no louder than the fire's crackle. He stopped sharpening, rested the blade on his knee. "Wasn't gonna leave you to die out there. Not my way." No questions, no suspicion. That, more than the warmth, unsettled her. She had learned to brace for inquiry, where she'd come from, whose child she carried, what she had done to deserve it. But he only poured her more broth when she finished the first mug, left a folded brush on the table beside her, and later placed a pair of boots at the foot of the bed. Women's boots, worn but clean. The silence in the house wasn't cold. It was space. Space to breathe, to think, to exist without apology. Outside, the world was still cruel. She had felt it on their trip to town, the whispers that moved faster than footsteps. "Widow from New Hope," they muttered, "carrying trouble." And Benjamin, solid beside her, had said nothing, only shifted closer, his presence a shield made of silence. That night on the porch, tea warming her hands, she asked him what she hadn't dared ask anyone else. "Why don't you defend me?" He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just turned his face to hers with the same quiet certainty. "Because what they think doesn't matter. You're here. You're safe. And if you want it, you're home." And though she said nothing in return, something in her exhaled for the first time in months. Not from surrender, but from the recognition of a stillness that asked nothing in return. The thaw came in quiet movements, first the icicles weeping from the eaves, then the frost retreating inch by inch from the window panes. The air no longer bit at dawn, but instead carried the smell of wet earth and old hay. On the ranch, mud replaced snow, and the ground sighed under the weight of its own awakening. Spring in these parts didn't arrive like a celebration. It unfolded like a bruise healing, slow, aching, inevitable. Sarah moved with that rhythm. Her days became muscle memory, not from habit, but from belonging. She rose early, her hands red from well water. Her sleeves rolled past the elbow as she kneaded bread with deliberate care. There was no hurry here, no overseer, no watchful women huddled behind chapel windows. The only eyes on her were the goats, blinking patiently as she milked them, and Benjamin's, calm and unreadable, whenever she passed him a plate or poured his coffee. It was in the afternoons that she returned to the quilt. Set by the window, a little wooden box beside her brimming with thread and scraps, Sarah stitched not to pass time, but to make sense of it. Each square was a ledger entry of a life not erased but rewritten, a piece of George's work shirt, frayed at the collar from years of wear, a strip from the apron her mother had worn every Christmas morning, the ribbon that once adorned the bonnet gifted to her, grudgingly, by the preacher's wife, now cut diagonally, cleansed of its origin. And then, one morning, there was a new offering, a swatch of coarse blue wool, folded neatly on the table. She recognized it at once. Benjamin's old coat, the one he wore the night he found her. It had a small tear near the seam, threadbare at the elbows. "Thought it might belong," he said, not looking up. She didn't answer, just held the wool to her chest, eyes closed, and nodded. Their connection was built not in words, but in gestures layered like the quilt, each one unspoken, each one stitched with something true. Evenings were quiet. He read by the oil lamp, and she sewed. They ate in silence, but it was the silence of the safe and the tired, not the awkwardness of strangers. Sometimes, when their fingers brushed at the wash basin, neither pulled away. There were no grand confessions, no rehearsed affections. But something real moved between them, steady and slow as spring. And in that stillness, Sarah began to believe, tentatively, cautiously, that perhaps she had not been broken, only buried. And that now, with every stitch, she was digging herself out. The cottonwoods held their breath. Their branches, just brushed with new life, shimmered faintly under the midday sun as tiny white blossoms detached and drifted down in slow spirals, as if the sky itself had chosen to weep in gentleness, not sorrow. It was the kind of day the land rarely offered, where wind moved like memory and light softened even the sharpest of shadows. Sarah stepped carefully through the grass, one hand resting on the rise of her belly, the other trailing the folds of her cotton dress. It was plain, unadorned, and pressed with care. Her hair, loosely braided, shimmered with threads of gold beneath the sun, and there was a steadiness to her gait that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with resolve. She had been broken, yes, but not undone. What remained had been mended with quiet things, small kindnesses, long silences, the rhythm of labor, and the unexpected refuge of a man who said little, but listened deeply. The town, once cruel in its whispers, had begun to shift like thawed ground. There were no grand reconciliations, no parade of apologies. But someone had left a bundle of diapers by the gate. A pie had been placed on the porch without a name. A knitted bonnet, white and delicate, had appeared in the mailbox. In places like this, redemption didn't wear ribbons. It arrived in silence, wrapped in gesture. At the edge of the grove, Benjamin waited. He was not dressed differently, not polished or prepared like a man rehearsing for ceremony. His boots were dusty, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he held his hat in both hands like he wasn't quite sure what to do with them. But his eyes, those steady, weather-worn eyes, watched her with something that had never been pity and had long since grown beyond patience. "I built something," he said, voice scratchy with nerves. He turned and pointed. A swing. Wooden seat, 2 thick ropes, tied high into the cottonwood's boughs. She smiled, wide and surprised. "It's beautiful," she whispered, fingers grazing the rope. "So are you," he said. Then he knelt, not out of tradition, not out of expectation, but because some moments demand reverence. "I don't know how to say the right things, but I know this. You never stopped carrying yourself with grace, even when the world refused to see it. You made a life out of nothing but ash and thread, and I'd be honored to spend mine beside it." The ring he held was simple, worn silver, unpretentious, honest. Sarah didn't cry. She simply took his hand, pressed her lips to his palm, and said, "Yes." The wind rose gently, stirring the blossoms. For a brief moment, the air filled with white petals that looked like snow and felt like blessing, and Sarah, who once stood alone in exile, now stood seen, chosen, not because she was broken, but because she had endured.